Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, joined by our legislative columnist in Victoria, Vaughn Palmer. Hi, Vaughn.
Hello, Harold.
I'm very much looking forward to these weekly election videos, conversations that we're going to have. How many elections is this for you now, Vaughn, covering from Victoria?
Oh, 300 or 400.
Yeah.
I've been here for 40 years, so I've covered a lot of elections.
Covered a lot of them. Well, I mean, give us
11 premiers and counting, and I throw in the and counting because you never know what's going to happen in a BC election.
Right. Well, is there anything that sets this one apart from previous elections heading in?
There's nothing like it. I mean, David Eby is running against a political party that didn't even exist when he became leader of the NDP just 2 years ago. And every opinion poll that we've seen in the last 2 weeks suggests it's a dead heat. The gap between the New Democrats and the Conservatives is like 2 points. That's a rounding error in the poll. So this is an incredibly competitive election. And the stuff that's already happened this year, like the disintegration of BC United and all these independents that are running, there's nothing quite like it. This is a unique election.
So given the uniqueness of the election, what are you going to be watching for and what do you think our viewers should be watching for in the first few days of the campaign from the leaders?
Well, I think the first thing you're going to see is you're going to see platforms. So they've been attacking each other and running attack ads, and that sort of is what happens in the early phase. But you're going to see rollouts of platforms. The Premier, in his speech to the Union of BC Municipalities on Thursday, got asked, by reporters, well, how come there's no promises here? And he said, come on, the campaign starts on Saturday. You're going to see a platform soon after that. And BC Conservatives, I mean, they're engaged in a pretty difficult activity. They're trying to build a political party at the same time as they fight an election. So I think what we'll see, first of all, is platforms. And I think we're going to see that there's a pretty big difference between the two parties on some of the key issues we're looking at. So there'll be a lot of that and a lot of focus on that. And I think then we'll look to see, what pattern do the opinion polls settle into? Because the preliminary situation is just that. It's a snapshot of where we stand at the beginning. Then you start to see the campaign dynamic play out. And again, in BC, the campaign dynamic matters a great deal.
Talking to pollster Steve Mossop earlier this week, he said that in his experience anyways, this is a very low number of undecideds heading into an election campaign. First of all, I think it's 11% in the poll that we released this week. Does that surprise you, or do you have any explanation as to why the undecided level would be so low, especially since the Conservatives, as you say, are fairly new to the scene?
Well, we've had a very charged political debate all year around some of the things we've seen. The government has been very, very active. The opposition parties, we had a merger of a sort between them, and one party disappeared. So there's been a lot of political discussion already. But in a campaign, voters can change their minds, just switch sides or take a second look at another party. And one of the things that the polling has shown, Harold, is that people don't have a very strong sense of John Rustad yet. They have a pretty strong sense of David Eby. He's been premier for 2 years. He's got a fairly good approval rating. I think Rustad's relatively low number of approval rating is mostly people saying, I don't really know the guy. I don't know much about him. And so I think that's the other thing we'll be looking at, is to see, as people get to know the leader of the opposition, well, he's not even that. That's how things have changed. Right. Leader of the opposition for British Columbia, folks, if you want to win the lottery prize on this, is still Kevin Falcon, the guy who shut down his party and withdrew from the field. So the official term. But yeah, I think as the thing goes on, you'll see how is Rustad doing defining himself. And that's not uncommon. People tend to discover the other party leaders during an election campaign because, of course, the government dominates the news and the coverage. They're the ones making all the decisions while we're between elections.
Okay. So again, we can often tell a lot about what the parties are thinking and what their own internal polling is telling them by where they spend their time and the issues they talk about. So where do you expect the leaders to be spending their time, at least in the initial days of the campaign?
I think there'll be an awful lot of time spent in and around Metro Vancouver. I think everybody expects that the election, Surrey is enormous now. It's a great large number of seats. It's, when I started, Surrey was 2 seats. It's now bigger than most of the entire northern half of the province. So Surrey, Richmond is interesting. The NDP won Richmond for the first time in 2020. They're fighting to hang on to those seats, but we've already seen some signs that because of the closeness of the polls, that the New Democrats are worried in places where they've not been worried in the past. They're worried over here in Victoria, which is an NDP town, right? But government intervened this week to basically tell the NDP-controlled Victoria School Board to smarten up and look at letting the police back into the schools in a liaison program. I don't think New Democrats would have done that in Victoria. Were they not hearing concerns on the doorsteps in an NDP town about the way some things are going? So you're right, we will chart where the party's leaders are spending their time. And initially, I think we'll see in and around Metro Vancouver. The Premier is planning to travel to some parts of the interior and the north as well. I think the other big clue that we've had about the party polling, and the parties have a lot more money and get a lot more detailed polling than we see.
Sure.
They drill right down to the riding level. I don't think we'd have seen the Premier make those big switches in the last week on the carbon tax and involuntary care and reverse positions he'd taken before. I don't think we would have seen that if the NDP polling wasn't telling the governing party, the NDP, what the public polling has been suggesting, which is we're into a very competitive election. And if the New Democrats don't play it well, they could be out. That's what their own polling is telling them. If it weren't, I don't think you'd have seen these big changes of position this close to an election.
Interesting. Well, your colleague in Victoria, Alec Lazenby, wrote this week too about the potential impact of independence.
Yes.
And we also have the Green Party still out there. It's still early, but how significant a role do you think either of those could play in terms of being spoilers or winning seats?
Well, on the independents, we have almost nothing to go on. You've got 6 incumbent MLAs, 5 of them who got elected as BC Liberals the last time and then went through BC United and then got dumped by BC United. And one of them, the New Democrat, who got kicked out of the government caucus by David Eby. That's Adam Walker, who's running on Vancouver Island. So you can't go back and find 6 incumbent MLAs running suddenly as independents. And I certainly in modern times, I don't know how far you'd have to go back to find it. I think we got party affiliation in BC more than 100 years ago, and I don't know if there's any precedent for this in all that time. So we've had one independent get elected in modern times, and that was Vicky Huntington. She did it twice as an independent out in South Delta. So it is possible to do it, but it's not really much you can look at. The Greens, they've been a factor in BC elections now for quite some time. And of course, they ended up with a balance of power in 2017. So they're more of a known quantity. But Sonia Furstenau, the leader of the Greens, has given up her riding on the island, which she held twice. And she's running here in Victoria, my riding. 3-way fight with the Conservatives and the NDP, but as I said, this is an NDP town. It's an uphill fight for first and all. Adam Olson, who's to me the best speaker in the House, has retired from the Greens. He's not running again. And a guy named Rob Botterill, who's a lawyer and activist, is the nominee there. And this is in Saanich North in the Islands. But I don't know how any of those ridings are going to play out. One thing, British Columbians, Harold, have said over the years that they don't much like either of the major parties, and they'd like an alternative. So here's your chance, right? You in some ridings, you've got an independent who's experienced. They're a known quantity. They're already an MLA, and they're running again for re-election. So I don't know how people will view them. You get turned off by the established parties, the big parties, or you get by the two main ones. Maybe you go to the Greens. Maybe you vote for an independent. In the past, those kind of people, they just haven't voted at all because they didn't feel there was any choice. So now they've got a choice.
Well, that was the other interesting thing when you talk about the BC United and the collapse of BC United. The pollster tells us that at least their polling is saying that support splintered multiple ways. Some of it went to the Greens, some of it went to the NDP, some of it went to the Conservatives. So I guess we can't assume that the Green vote would necessarily spoil the NDP vote because they could draw from the Conservative side as well.
Yeah. I mean, for shorthand purposes, pundits and political scientists and political parties, they tend to divide the public and spread them out on a spectrum, right, from left to right. But voters see stuff differently, right? They take we're seeing that there's some polling indicating that younger voters are taking a look at the Conservatives, right? And you sort of assume that they're young, they're liberal, they're, all that, I mean, small L liberal. They lean left. They're looking at the Conservatives, and the polling I've seen indicates that young people are going, well, the system isn't really working very well for me, right? They don't see the opportunities. They don't see housing affordability, and they're starting to take a look at a party on the political spectrum that in the past people sort of went, well, you're not going to get young people to vote for the Conservatives. Apparently they are. So that's it. I think if we're gonna have a model of an election for us to look at the starting point, I think you look at 2017, which was very, very close. 2017 is the closest election in modern times in BC. The BC Liberals, as they were known then, led by Christy Clark, lost their majority in the legislature by fewer than 200 votes in one riding. If they'd gotten one more vote per polling division in that one riding, Christy Clark would have had her majority, she could have governed, and John Horgan might never have taken office. I mean, it's a what if, right? And so what, right. But it's so close. I mean, the voter, the listener, the person out there, take this thing really seriously, because it really does matter if you vote. Even if you are in a riding where you go, whatever, so-and-so is going to win it. They've always won it, right? Your vote helps your party, whoever you're voting for, they get money from Elections BC for the next 4 years based on how many votes they got. So it's, we've gotten rid of the big money in BC politics. So now political parties are partly funded by donors in smaller amounts, but they're also funded by the government, not the government, by taxpayers. So I say you couldn't ask for an election where it matters more that you look at your choices, take them seriously, and recognize that this could be another very, very close election. And either party could win, or you could end up in another balance of power where you mentioned, Harold, the Independents and the Greens hold the balance of power, and it'd be interesting to see who they decide to make premier.
Very interesting. This has been great, Vaughn. I look forward to doing this every week. We'll catch up next Friday with a full week of campaigning under our belts. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. That's very good. Pleasure to talk to you.